Welcome to the Vermont Urban and Community Forestry Program's webinar, Community Gravel Beds for Bare Root Planting. I'm Kate Four, and I work for the Vermont Urban and Community Forestry Program, a partnership between the University of Vermont Extension and the Vermont Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation. I will be moderating the webinar this evening. Our presenters tonight are Gary Johnson and Chad Giblin. Gary is a professor of Urban and Community Forestry at the University of Minnesota Extension, Department of Forest Resources. His research and outreach includes tree production and community engagement in urban forest management. Chad is a scientist in horticultural science at the University of Minnesota. His research and outreach is focused on exploring new tree species and new production and planting practices to enhance establishment and long-term success. Chad is also selecting and researching Minnesota native elms for Dutch elm disease tolerance. Welcome, Chad and Gary, and I'll now turn the mic over to you guys for tonight's presentation.
Great, thank you. Can everyone hear me? Or at least Kate, can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you fine, Gary.
Great, wonderful, wonderful. We will be, Chad and I are sharing a headset and a microphone, so at different times we're going to be passing the headset to one another, and there'll be just a little bit of a lag, but we should be able to do this fairly smooth. We've practiced this a couple times, but thanks a lot for joining us, and hopefully we're going to get you excited enough about, experimenting a little bit with this option for holding trees or growing trees, whatever you want to call it. Chad likes to call it an end user system. It really is not intended to be a growing system. It's intended to be a system for communities that are looking for options to reforest the community, in particular reforesting after catastrophic tree losses. You've probably been watching some of the weather news lately, and then southwestern Minnesota and southeastern South Dakota, where there are terrible ice storms. There are a couple major communities that essentially have lost well over half the trees in their community. So they're going to be faced with some major reforesting issues. And the gravel bed nursery, the community gravel bed nursery, offers these communities an option for reforesting. And in a lot of cases, it's a much more affordable option for reforesting. So we're going to start off. We have it basically broken down into these 7 points as we go through. And we'll start off a little bit with what we call a history of healing, and a lot of these words are meant to be puns. And then the gravel as a healer itself, then move into some of the uses and maybe some of the, what's kind of interesting is how we originally got started working with trees and gravel and how it's kind of ended up for us. So there's been an interesting to us, but we're tree huggers, so put that interesting into in perspective on that. Healing, if many of you have worked in nurseries, healing is, a centuries-old process. And in particular, it is a process for nurseries that grow trees or harvest trees bare-rooted. And in most nurseries in the temperate climate, trees that are field-grown that are going to be sold as bare-rooted are actually harvested in the autumn, most of the time, somewhere between early October and into December, depending on the climate. And then these trees are held in cold storage, usually some type of controlled atmosphere storage that a nursery may have. And then in the spring, they get shipped out. And when they're shipped out in the spring, going into different parts of the country, sometimes they're potted up right away, and then sometimes they're temporarily healed in. And the healing in process is essentially a technique for holding the plants temporarily, keeping the roots moist. The idea of healing it into a media that's really nice and loose. It is temporary, so it's nice and loose. So when time comes to move the trees out of the healed-in area, it's not like you have to redig them again and lose a bunch more roots. So the figure to the top left, the first nursery I worked at in the 60s, this was very, very common. We would straight side on the left side, angled to the right, put the bare-rooted trees in, and usually the material we would use would be real coarse sawdust. And that would allow us to hold these trees through the spring sales season, or at least halfway through the spring sales season. And a lot of times we were holding the trees because they were fruit trees, fruit shrubs. You can be very simple, as the photo on the right shows. Just put them in buckets, put in wading pools, and livestock tanks. Anything works fairly well for something like that. There are a lot of different types of media that people use for healing. Some people use pure sand. Some people, like I mentioned earlier, use coarse materials like coarse sawdust, etc. Basically, what you're looking for is something that holds moisture, and then when you lift the plants eventually, you're going to have good root production in it while it's been healed in. But when you lift the plants later, you're not going to tear off all the roots. I mean, that's the whole reason then for healing in plants temporarily. Using gravel as a healer, when we first, I don't know if you've ever read any of Chris Starbuck's articles that he's written or attended any of his classes. Chris likes to refer to what he does as spreading the gospel of gravel. And Chris has really done that better than anybody. He's really promoted the use of gravel as a healing media. But when we started conducting some research on this, we found that gravel had been used as a healer for a long time. It's just, how do you define gravel? Sometimes it was pea stone, very, very small diameter stone. Sometimes it was larger, mixed in with sand. People have been using it for quite a while, but for whatever reason, they kept quiet about it. And a lot of people that could have benefited from it were denied that information until Chris Starbuck came along. So we owe a lot to Chris in terms of getting the message out. But so gravel's been used for a long time. It's really not that new. The nice thing about gravel is it's so easy with gravel to manage the sweet spot of the optimum amount of moisture and the optimum amount of oxygen that living roots must have. You must have both oxygen and moisture for roots to respire, and then respiration allows them to grow. And if you deny either oxygen or moisture, then you're going to have a greatly reduced root system. So that's why, a material like clay is a horrible healing media. Sand is much better, but gravel, and we'll get into different sizes, it's a really good media for managing that. You don't have any drainage problems unless you do something silly and build your gravel bed at the bottom of a poorly drained area. Gravel, at least not in our lifetime, it's not going to degrade. We're going to refer to one nursery that's been using the same gravel for 16 years, and it's a very large commercial nursery. Most people that we've talked, actually, I've never talked to anybody that uses gravel as a healing media that has had problems with diseases or insects. So, it's probably happened somewhere, but it's a very low frequency. It's reusable. We do encourage people to use local materials. And like I mentioned, the wonderful thing about it is when you move trees out of the gravel bed, there's hardly any root loss. You basically determine how many roots you want to leave back in the gravel. But the nice thing is when you lift the plants, the gravel more or less, especially with pea stone, it just kind of tumbles off. And the worst that you have to do is maybe hit it with a stream of water to knock it off a little bit. This is one of the nurseries that we've worked quite a bit with in Rochester, Minnesota. And this is their 16th year. This is a 35,000 square foot gravel bed healing in area. And they retail plants out of this probably close to 9 months of the year. Now, one other thing I'm going to mention on this is 16 years. They have trees in the ground. They sell them balled and burlap. They sell them containerized, container grown, and then gravel bed. And they'll have as many as 15,000 trees a year move out of this gravel bed. They put a 2-year guarantee on it. This is a retail nursery. It's not a wholesale nursery. So if gravel isn't working out for them, they should be bankrupt by now. And they're not. They're doing quite well. So that is a good commercial use. I'm going to turn this over now to Chad because this is really how we began using gravel as a healing and media in earnest. And so Chad's going to take the next part.
Well, thanks, Gary, and welcome, folks, to the presentation. So I'm really happy to share some of our experiences with you all and our results with gravel. So Gary mentioned that we started out in maybe an unconventional sort of way, looking at ways to use gravel to recover dysfunctional root systems in trees. And I teamed up with a local arborist and a tree care company, and they were really interested in ways they can use gravel to take trees that are otherwise dysfunctional or unsaleable, and then regenerate a root system on those trees to get them out to new homes and so forth. And this photo here shows an example of a typical pot-bound container nursery stock. We also experimented with B&B trees that we basically washed off, as well as other trees that we excavated from pot-bound situations using air excavation tools like an air spade or an air knife. One thing that we found right away, and this is a situation that gravel can't address or even correct, is planting depth issues. And in order for gravel to be used as a recovery tool, you really need to make sure that you have that first mean order root or that root flare at or near the surface of your root ball. And this photo here shows really how deep some of these root systems were in the container. We've seen depths as deep as is that a little better? I'm going to turn up the volume a little more. How's that? A little bit better? Okay, sorry about that. So again, just to recap this photo here, just shows us using pruning saws to go into pot-bound containers and to correct the deeply planted root systems. And like I said, while gravel can recover dysfunctional root systems, it cannot correct deeply buried stems or planting depth issues. So I mentioned B&B, and I know some of you might be familiar with some of the folks that are working with washing B&B to expose roots to get a better feel for root systems that are in those systems. This photo here shows a circling root system that Gary discovered inside a typical B&B elm. And had that root system not been washed to expose it, we would have had no idea what's happening inside that root ball. And again, one more reason to promote use of systems like gravel bed and other bare root production or holding systems that allow you to really see and get a good grip on what you're dealing with in a root system. So in this case here, this tree was excavated and washed, and then now we can use gravel to recover that dysfunctional root system and hope for enhanced success. So one of the first actual trials we developed here or started here at the University of Minnesota was looking at recovering pot-bound nursery stock. So that first slide that I showed you that had that really severe circling from what's basically a 10-gallon nursery can, we were fortunate enough to receive a large truckload of trees at a local wholesale nursery deemed unsaleable due to being really pot-bound. So what we have here is a below-ground gravel bed that has cathedral elm, which is a hybrid disease-resistant elm, and a Freeman maple, Sienna Glen, that were severely pot-bound. And basically, we installed those trees into these gravel beds to see, what we could recover in terms of a usable root system after 2 growing seasons. I should mention too, and Gary will cover this in more detail a bit later, but we did look at 3 different gravel compositions. So each plot here contains a different gravel composition with amendments like calcine clay, which is turfus, which you use on baseball infields, and then also sand as an amendment to gravel. And so like I mentioned, we left the trees in there for two full growing seasons. They had one full winter in the gravel, and this is pretty typical of what we found after that time. We lifted the trees out. We actually had to use a skid loader and skid loader and a tow strap to harvest them out, and even then we did have to go in and slightly root prune to actually get the trees out of the gravel. So that's sort of testament to the amount of rooting that you can get in this type of system. So this kind of shows you the edge where we did cut to allow excavation on these trees. So we had a question about any concerns about recircling. I guess I'm gonna. I think we have a pretty good photo that shows that in a few slides. So I think maybe should we cover that then? Yeah. Because this slide doesn't really show you what we saw actually coming out of that original soil ball. Here we have it right here. So obviously you wanted to keep your gravel in your gravel bed or your gravel pit, whatever you want to call it. So we do recommend washing that gravel off. We're just using a hose and a sprayer here, and you can kind of see here where here is the original root ball here. In this case, we actually cut the edge of that to disrupt the circling, and then everything out of that is basically new roots that formed into that gravel during those 2 growing seasons. And we have a question here. Are you from Polly? Just asking, are you feeding or just watering? And again, so a question of fertilizer. Yeah, in some of the studies that we've done, yes, we do fertilize with a slow release fertilizer over the top. Some folks do not use fertilizer. I guess with the system set up as it currently is, it's not really intended to be a production system. It's just a holding system. So I think a lot of the communities that Gary works with in particular are not fertilizing, but that wouldn't necessarily preclude you from doing it if you were to notice a specific nutrient deficiency, much like you'd scout, in any type of system, either container or field grown. And I'm going to pass it back to Gary.
Okay, now I'll probably have to adjust his microphone. Chad is the gentle giant, and he has the soft voice, and I'm the big mouth. So usually I have to tone things down a little bit when I speak into these. I mentioned earlier our work with the gravel bed and nurseries has kind of evolved. So in the beginning, we were conducting a lot of experimental work on could we recover trees, and we found that we could. Chad did some really interesting early work with that. Could we correct root system? Yes, we can. We've done it very, very successfully. But I wanted to take this to the next level, and this is where we have really, really thrown our efforts into these community gravel beds. And in particular, we tied this in with our work. We have a program here in urban forestry in our Department of Forest Resources and in horticulture, but it's called the Community Engagement and Preparedness Program. We work with communities around the state, and in particular, this was really stimulated by the visit from emerald ash borer in Minnesota. In Minnesota, we're finally #1 with something. We have more ash in Minnesota than any other state. It used to be Michigan, and you know why we're #1 now. We have a lot in the urban forest too. In the urban forest, statistically in Minnesota, ash is the #2 tree. But depending on your community, you could be weighted more or less with ash trees. So this engagement program, we work with communities, we train volunteers, we help them conduct surveys or inventories of the community to try to determine their vulnerability to emerald ash borer, what percentage of their community, both public and private urban forest, is ash. And then we provide technical assistance through that, as well as technical assistance to help them recover. And so this is, not an unusual situation when you look at these 2 graphs. It's the same community. The graph to the upper left is an inventory of public trees. To the lower right is on private trees. If you look in the public trees, ash is 35%. So 1 out of every 3 trees in the boulevards and the parks is going to be an ash tree. And if you look at the private landscapes, it's actually over 50%. So over half the trees in this community, in the yards, the privately owned yards, would be an ash tree. And to give you another little bit of a statistic on this, is in Minnesota there are approximately 4 trees on private property for every one that's on public property. And so one of the questions that just popped up is, how are you estimating ash on private land? We don't estimate, we go right on private land. So if it's a small community, if they have fewer than 5,000 people in the community, we conduct complete inventories, and it's a complete inventory of private land as well as public land, unless somebody requests that we do not go on private land. If it's a large community, then we use a stratified, weighted inventory a survey system that is extremely accurate. It's been used for almost 30 years, time tested. That's all I can say about that. So we feel very confident on this perspective. When we look at these communities, they're very much at risk. Well, the other thing about Minnesota, it's really not any different than any other state in the union. Most of these communities, especially in greater Minnesota and rural Minnesota, they've been zeroed out. The local aid to these governments is just almost non-existent. So most of these communities, they don't even have forestry departments anymore. And especially if you're in the community, what we're looking at right now is in Morris, Minnesota. Statistically in Morris, when you look at both the public and the private, 44% of all trees, public or private, green ash. So theoretically, this little town on the prairie could lose half of the trees, almost half the trees, emerald ash borer, that are basically providing them with some type of windbreak. This is flat country, it's on the prairie, and without trees, it's not a great place to be in the wintertime, and trying to play Frisbee in the summertime is just miserable. You throw a Frisbee and it ends up in Madison, Wisconsin. So these are the type of communities that we thought would be if you talk in terms of what are winnable situations, these are winnable situations. So we work with these communities. We provide technical support to them to help them build community gravel beds. And what I like to say when we go into these communities is I'm very frank with the people, is I'm not going to do anything for you. I'm going to help you take care of this yourself. So these are all community volunteers. There's one person here, this gentleman with a beard, that is on the project team from the university. But what we do is go into the community, we engage citizens and volunteers in the inventory process, but then also in the reforestation process. So these are community volunteers. You're looking at preachers, and one of the people in here owns a golf cart business, and they're all out there constructing the gravel bed and then stocking it with trees. This particular one is Hendricks, Minnesota, one of the places I dearly love. This is right on, well, half the town is in Minnesota, half the town is in South Dakota. This is a community that over half the trees in the community were ash trees. And this is their 3rd year of using the gravel bed. They have 753 people in the town. They plant 75 trees a year. So they're restocking their community. They're diversifying it. You don't see any ash trees in this. And they built this system, they restock it, and this is their 3rd year, and they've had phenomenal luck. Now, at some point, you may be wondering, why don't these communities just buy the bare root stuff in the spring and plant it in the spring? Well, in Minnesota, and in particular in western Minnesota, where the weather is so harsh, a good way to kill a tree is to plant a whole bunch of them in the spring, because the summers are so unpredictable and so hard on plant materials. It's windy. 2012, we had the windiest summer on record. We had I think it was the 2nd hottest summer on record, and we had the 2nd droughtiest summer on record. And that's fairly typical. It is windy, hot, and dry. And when you plant in the spring, a community like this, if they planted 75 trees, quite honestly, there is no way in the world they could keep these trees watered all through the summer. But by planting in the autumn, late summer, so late August, right up to Thanksgiving, this is when you're going to get your highest survival rate. And, this isn't one of those, you need to look up a research report to see if this is true. Just talk to any of the communities. They have actually had changes made in bonding programs in Minnesota to allow them to plant in the autumn because that's when they get the highest survival rate. So again, they're looking for winnable situations. I love this community, and they are so 753 people. Remember, they are so proud of that gravel bed they built that they're also very proud that they're a Tree City, USA. They paid for the design and construction of the sign out of their own money and installed it. And that gentleman to the right is the mayor of the community. Just a wonderful person, real tree hugger too. And this has been one of our very, very successful communities. They received an award too a year ago for all the work they've done. This next little part, before I turn back over to Chad, is actually constructing these community gravel bed systems. And I hesitated on using this slide, but I decided to do it anyway. This is in Crookston, Minnesota, northwest Minnesota, and we've had just really, really good success with growing trees and gravel in Crookston. But this is an example of what I normally recommend you don't do. Don't use good soil to put rocks on top of it. I mean, if you have good soil, plant trees in good soil. But this is, if you look at the surrounding, this is an environmental school, so they have community gardens, they have greenhouses, et cetera, and this ended up being good for them. And also, if you look behind it, they have a nice fence to keep the deer out. The whole area is fenced. So this just ended up being their preference. Normally, we recommend that you build these things on old parking lots, old driveways, areas that are not good growing areas can be good areas for constructing the beds. The slides that Chad showed you, when we first started building our beds, we thought because it is cold here in Minnesota that maybe we needed to build them below ground, and that became one of our early lessons learned, and I think Chad's going to talk a little bit about that later on too. But for these communities, we recommend that the gravel beds be constructed above ground. And so here I am, and this is me right here, the star to the lower right. That's about as much work as I ever do. I don't even know why I had gloves. Oh, I remember, it was cold. Otherwise, I don't even have gloves on because I don't do anything. But, in this case, I'm teaching these people how to square up a bed because nothing is more embarrassing than a gravel bed that looks like a parallelogram or a trapezoid or something. So I teach them on how to square it up, how to level it. And then once that part is done, in this particular case, they decided they were going to bring soil up on the outside edges all the way around. So the plastic you see there is more to keep the soil from the outside from washing into the pea stone. That's the only reason. Normally we don't have plastic like that. And so as this is being constructed, this is part of the technical support we provide. And we really push that these gravel beds are constructed in a way that if they serve their use and it's time to get rid of them, you can actually reuse them or you can move them elsewhere. So all the materials that are used, the wood materials, are pressure treated, and all the attachments are either lag screws or screws. There are no nails or anything that basically when it comes time to tear it apart, you would destroy the bed. We try to construct them in a way that they are almost like Lincoln logs or erector sets that you can set up in another site if you wish to. And we also try to help communities find recycled materials or donated materials. Talk a little bit about cost in a moment here. We also encourage them to be creative in building these things too. I don't want to go into a community and say, hi, I'm Gary and I'm from the university and I'm here to save you. I'm here to help. And if they can come up with some local ideas to make these beds even structurally better, that's great. So here we are in Morris, and they came up with this wonderful angle iron idea of stiffening up the corners. Works awesome. And then if you look to the outside, to the left of this, you see that they use, you can tell the Public Works Department there helped put this together. These are old stop sign posts. They just drove them into the ground, did just a really nice job of stabilizing these beds. We recommend that the entire inside of the bed be lined with a Geotextile fabric liner, and this has one purpose, and again, it kind of ties into the longevity of the bed. So if a community then decides after 2, 3, 5 years, whatever, that they no longer have a use for the bed, or they may want to move it somewhere else, this geotextile liner keeps the stone from being forced into the soil and making a huge mess. So it ends up being cleaner to clean up or neater to clean up the whole area, to take off the sides, and the fabric liner is basically one big blanket that the pea stone is sitting on. So that's the only reason for this. There's nothing else. And it's not that expensive, so it's fairly easy to construct this. You need approximately 12 to 15 inches of stone to hold trees in these beds. And so when we construct, we recommend that the sides, they're 2 boards high, and the boards are 2 by 10-inch boards, pressure-treated wood. So a 2 by 10 is a little, it's about 9.5 inches thick. So that gives you, the sides roughly 19 inches high, and 12 to 15 inches of the entire depth is in stone. You can put more in if you want to. The most expensive part of these beds is the stone, and actually it's not the cost of the stone, it's the cost of transporting stone. So trucking heavy materials like this is extremely expensive. So we try to keep this, what do you actually need versus what can you get. Irrigation, it's as diverse as you can imagine. Here's one bed. These are very inexpensive soaker hoses. A 50-foot, one of these soaker hoses, it's just an oozing type hose. 50 feet is less than $10. These work just fine. Kind of string it down through the bed. You're not, you don't want the bed to be saturated. You want the gravel to be moist. And really also at this point, I'd like to emphasize too, if you can see where the gravel is piled up against the stem, for all of you that may be sitting there going, oh no, this is bad, you can't bury the stem. We've been trying to get people not to plant trees so deeply. These trees aren't planted. These trees are being held there. And the top part of that pea stone dries out real fast. So you really need to get that first main order root down into the pea stone, approximately 4 inches down in. That's really where you hit the moisture stable layer of the pea stone. And then your goal is you're trying to keep this pea stone moist, not saturated. If it's saturated, then the roots are gonna die. So that's, this is one type of irrigation. Here's another one, just a little pop-up head, so works just fine. It's really up to the community. We have over 20 of these in communities around the state now, and just about everyone has their own unique irrigation system. We have one in one community that they built by the water treatment plant, and once a day they flood the beds. So just fill it right up with water and let the water drain out, and that's it. And the next day they do the same thing again. So anything that works is a good irrigation system. Now we're going to be going a little bit back and forth on this, but just to kind of start off, I'm going to go back to this watering thing in a moment here. But one of the things that we learned is when you say pea stone, there are a lot of different types of pea stone. And so you in your head may be thinking nice, clean, washed river gravel, like the little icon up in the upper left-hand corner, and not a lot of fine material. And yeah, that's pea stone to me. Then you go somewhere else, and their pea stone may be even smaller, or it may be larger, may have a lot of fines mixed into it, almost like granite dust mixed in. It may have sand mixed in. So part of our research as we set up these beds and use local materials around the state is we do a lot of analysis of what people call locally pea stone. And the analysis is we're looking for the percentage of that pea stone that is made up of fine material. And, fine material can be positive or negative. The positive part of it is it can hold more moisture, and some plants do better in that. The negative part of it is it can hold more moisture, and some plants don't do better in that. So defining what is pea stone and what's going to work best can be a challenge. And the only thing I can tell you is to go out there and get a bucket of it and stick your hand in it and make sure that it's not full of clay dust, because we have found that too. Somebody has asked question earlier, can the slides be made available to download? And I believe this is this whole webinar is going to be made available. But in the very end of this, you're going to see Chad's email address and my email address. And if you would like, we would be more than glad to send this. This whole PowerPoint has been double compressed, so it's less than 10 megabytes. Neither Chad nor I feel proprietary about our pictures and stuff. And if you're going to use these pictures to spread the word or spread the gospel of gravel, we are more than willing to accommodate that. So let's look at some of these other slides, and then I'm going to turn this over to Chad partway through too. I did mention earlier we're going to talk about above ground or below ground. Monitoring water is the biggest challenge by far. Trucking the stone is the biggest expense. Monitoring the water level, the moisture content's the toughest part. Different trees perform differently. Why wouldn't they? They perform different species perform differently if you grow them in the field. They perform differently when you grow them in containerized systems. So why would it be any different with gravel beds? And that's probably the emphasis of our research most recently is trialing different species. And we've come up with some recommendations. Keep in mind that gravel grows roots. We are not using this to grow stems and twigs. And earlier, somebody asked if we fertilize. These community gravel beds, we never, ever fertilize. So if a community wants to plant out a 1 3/4 caliper tree, buy an 1 3/4 caliper tree from the nursery in the spring, because it's not going to get any bigger in the gravel bed. What's going to get bigger is the root system, and it's amazing root system by autumn. And then finally, a point we'll make is this autumn planting. So again, at this point, I'm going to turn this back over to Chad for a while, maybe for the rest of this, and we'll talk a little bit about some of these lessons, including this particular one with our first below ground gravel bed.
Okay, I'm going to turn up the volume here a little bit. There we go. Okay, so yes, this is actually for me. This is a real fun little history lesson or lesson learned, and like Gary mentioned, we were really interested in the possibility of overwintering trees in the gravel bed in Minnesota, and logically we thought, well, the roots will freeze above ground, so we have to get them below ground. So I spent a lot of time to get an excavator and excavate down 30 inches deep into what was otherwise perfectly good field soil, and install 2 different gravel bed systems here. Initially, we were really interested in the possibility of using a recirculation type irrigation system, and this here shows a section of a perforated culvert that we used in this large bed is located over here, and then we just installed your basic sump pump that we got at a local home improvement store, and tried to recirculate what was basically the same water throughout the entire bed here using in this case drip tape or T-tape that it's sometimes called. And unfortunately, what we found was that we had severe problems with algae, and the stems were coated literally bright green after a couple of days, and we realized that even if and this is without any fertility, that we wanted to use fresh water, or in the case of Hutchinson, at least water that's been treated in some way. So that ruled out the recirculation system. So after that, we went to basically irrigating with well water. And again, just in terms of keeping this accessible and affordable for communities, who are turning out to be the real main end user now, having it above ground is easy to build. Anyone can do it. You don't have to hire a Komatsu excavator, and it really just makes it a lot more easy to implement at any scale, really. So that was a big lesson learned. And another thing, you can see some really large trees in here. So this, I think the largest tree that I ever tried to recover in the bed was a hackberry that we had harvested out with an 88-inch tree spade. And the user, they couldn't transplant it to its final location until later that year. So we we chose to hold it over in the gravel bed for the entire summer, and that was a 6-inch tree. So we just assumed that you needed 24 or 30 inches of gravel to retain such a tree. But really what Gary's been finding in a lot of the community work he's been doing is that that 12 to 15 inches is really all you need when you're dealing with typical stock that you would want to plant in a boulevard or a park. And obviously there's exceptions to everything, but that's what we found. So again, keep it above ground and go with that 12 to 15 inches of gravel, and by all means, use fresh water or water that's not been running through the system repeatedly. For the next few slides, I just want to share a few just examples of results that we found here over the years. And again, not everything we do is replicated research. A lot of it is just observations that we've noted over the years. So a lot of this isn't going to show up in a peer review journal, but it will show up in recommendations and sort of end user guides that Gary and his team have been working on, and ways to get this information directly to the folks that use it, who may or may not be reading a typical scientific journal. So we mentioned being prepared for emerald ash borer. I found that this slide is kind of ironic in that this is these are all Manchurian ash, which is the Fraxinus manchurica, and this I believe is a Mancana variety. So in spite of having EAB literally in our backyard, there's still a lot of interest in other species or varieties that are maybe more tolerant of the insect. So Gary and his team have been actually producing these small little liners of Mancana ash in individual small little gravel beds in our research nursery here. And again, this just gives you kind of an idea of the range of the incredible amount of roots that could be grown in the gravel. So here's a real nice example here. But then just below it is exact same variety with considerably smaller root systems. So again, even within varieties or species, your results will not always be predictable or the same. So one thing to be prepared for. And again, one thing that Gary really likes to recommend is that if you have a bad root system to start with, gravel will not give you a good root system every time. There's ways of recovering poor root systems, but the best situation is to use those ANSI guidelines and to select and to accept nursery stock that meets specifications and is functional right off the bat, and that's the best way to get the best root system. So there we have Mancana, Manchurian ash. Nice tree too, interesting on the top as well. Another species that may not be expected to do well in gravel bed is black walnut, and this is one that we've tried several times in, and this is kind of neat here. You can see this dark black coarse root system that is real common, but then right below that is one season's worth of intensive real fine fibrous root production, and these trees did great in the gravel bed. And again, one of those ones that you might not expect to do well, but it did great. We just had a question about do we supply any shading during the recovery period? At least in my experience, I know Gary may have something to comment on this as well. All of our gravel beds that we've worked with in the research setting have always been in full sun. So I mean, I think it's almost a full day of sun, no matter where you put the sun or time of year. Gary, do you have any? Yeah. So throughout all of his work throughout Greater Minnesota, everything is full sun, and that's obviously probably the best catch-all for most species. But again, if you want to produce some understory type trees or shrubs like natives for reforestation or revegetation, so then in that situation, maybe constructing a shade structure over the top might be good. But we've never done any work with any shading, but I guess definitely no reason not to give it a try. So there we have black walnut. Yeah, it did great. And again, when I first showed you some slides, we were looking at some root systems after 2 seasons in the gravel bed. And again, this is just another shot of a washed Freeman maple root system. And in this slide here, you can see the original containerized root ball, and then just both the size and the amount of roots coming out of that after two growing seasons. And like I said, this, had we not gone in and root pruned those trees with spading shovels, you know, this tree would have flipped the skid loader into the gravel bed. So in this case, we did have to root prune these trees to actually get them out. And I think Gary mentioned earlier that you can get any amount of roots that you want, and a lot of it too is like, well, how many roots can you actually physically harvest out? And in most cases, this type of harvest can be done with one or two people of average strength. So this was a very pretty extreme case where we had you know, I think they were well over 2 inches in stem caliper when we put them in. So again, just another testament to Freeman maple and their ability to grow roots in this system. And yep, I'm going to turn it over to Gary so he can talk about costs of the system.
Okay, we're getting close to the end now, and a few comments. Some of the more common questions people ask, costs, all the way down to what does well, what doesn't do well, from our experience anyway. I'm going to show you some extremes. This is Fargo, North Dakota. Yes, every tree that the city of Fargo plants is a gravel bed tree. And so this is fairly common scene for them. They have probably the most elaborate of all the gravel beds I've seen. Concrete sides. I mean, it's if you're into gravel beds, this one just makes the hair stand up on the back of your neck. It's so beautiful. But they paid a lot of money for it. But interestingly enough, the head of this, Jeff Haberman, said that they effectively paid for the cost of this bed within 7 years with a higher survival rate and then less expensive nursery stock. And one of the common questions that people have is, do you have to dip the roots in hydrogel when you move them out of a bed? You know, some people do. That one nursery I showed you in the beginning down in Rochester, they dip theirs in a hydrogel. We never do. I think we experimented with it 1 year, and it was just kind of a sticky mess, actually. So what we do, we pull the plants out of gravel, and we immediately either cover them with a tarp or we put them in plastic bags, garbage bags. Make sure you keep them out of the sun, though. If you leave them in a dark garbage bag and put them in the sun, you're going to have parboil. Isn't that a handsome bed? This took me forever to find this bed. This is at the University of Minnesota in Morris. This is over in the prairie. And they said, oh, yeah, you ought to go see our bed. We've been using it for years. Well, this thing is kind of like a lagoon filled in with pea stone. And look how small that pea stone is, too. That's almost sand. But this bed did great. You know, they had no reason to put in anything fancier because it did so well. And as we mentioned earlier, when you list these, this is a good example. This is a crabapple. It's been in the bed for about 8 weeks, and that you can see the original woody branch root system. And then this is all new roots. Crabapples are one of the plants that do exceptionally well. But the nice thing is you can just pull these right out, and there's very, very little root loss. This is just a partial listing, you know, and really what I'm trying to show here is that we look at different species that we've worked with in terms of how well did they do in the gravel bed, and then how well did they do once they were transplanted out. We try to follow them for at least 3 years. And then was there any particular time that was best for moving them out, summer or autumn? And quite honestly, sometimes we just didn't have very good luck. And now just to kind of finish things off, once again, I'm going to pass this over to Chad. And Chad's just going to walk you through kind of a palette of the range of how we've used the gravel beds in the past, and that will conclude our presentation. So here's Chad again.
Thanks, Gary. So so Gary mentioned one thing was survival of spring planted nursery stock, especially in western Minnesota, and again, one of the situations that we found too is that even in areas that typically get a lot of rainfall, if you have a dry year, big investment in bare root stock in the spring is lost when those trees just literally cannot be watered by shrinking budgets. So here we have here is kind of what I like to call is a Direct-to-Boulevard type gravel bed tree, and this is a fall fiesta sugar maple, and you can see this is about 2 inches in stem caliper. Jonathan's a big boy. He's over 6 feet tall, and this fall or in the fall when these are planted out, what we're hoping and expecting is to see a much better survival compared to typical spring planted bare root in a city boulevard. And just one thing I wanted to mention too that Gary relayed here is that the typical size for most of these community gravel beds is a 10 by 30 above ground gravel bed. And again, that ties in well to available lumber and typical sizes that are available. And again, the cost for that is in the range of $1,300 to $1,500. So just to kind of close out the cost section. Just had a quick question on experiences in keeping trees over the winter, or do we plant them out the same season? Actually, both things happen quite routinely. I showed you the example where we overwintered pot-bound containers over winter. Many wholesale and retail nurseries keep their trees in the bed over the winter routinely. The grower, there's a gravel bed grower or holder in Crookston, and they are overwintering trees above ground all the time. And so the damage that we thought we would see with cold temps in the winter just isn't there even in above ground beds. So I would say that trees are routinely kept over the winter in gravel beds. The key there is that you want to get them out while you can still move them. The longer that tree stays in the bed, the more difficult it will be to move because it'll just have so many roots. And I've had trees in the bed for as long as 3 seasons, and it really took a heck of a effort to get them out. One thing that we want to relate to is that when you are overwintering trees in the beds, especially in exposed sites, one problem that we've really tried to address is rodents and other critter damage over the winter, and just the girdling can be severe on trees that are out in open areas where the bunnies and the woodchucks and everyone else likes to chew on them. So I'm just going to walk through just a few examples here just to give you an idea of what can you expect if you want to try gravel as a healer. Even within same species, like I mentioned with the Mancana ash, you can get a broad range of responses. Here is a crabapple with a pretty bad root system. It's what we call a windswept root system. And even though the fine roots wanted to grow this way, it just couldn't do it. So again, why not start with a healthy root system, and then you end up with a fibrous root system at the end. So again, really choose that bare rootstock wisely at the beginning, and go onto the internet and look up those ANSI specifications for nursery stock and use them, and that's why they're there, because we know that that's going to help trees survive. Compared to the container stock or B&B or whatever, gravel bed trees are easy to handle. I mean, if this tree here was even in the 2 or 5 gallon container, Liam's arm here would be getting pretty tired by the end. So if you think about maybe hauling two or maybe 3 containers per load, you can probably haul 20 or 30 bare root or gravel bed trees in the same load. So it's an efficient way to move trees and handle, and it's also easy on your volunteers and your workers. So this is a great system to add to volunteer events, because it really is easy on people that might not want to lift a 500-pound B&B tree. And again, just to mention the ANSI, it's the ANSI Z60.1 nursery stock standards, and those are freely available online. Just type it into your favorite search engine, and you'll can learn everything you've ever wanted to know about nursery stock. Just a few more examples. This shows the skid loader here with a toe strap holding that Freeman maple, and washing it off. And again, just the quantity of roots that are left even after root pruning that root system, just to get it out of the bed. So again, it's just fabulous, and you'd expect that. I mean, Freeman maple is a fast growing tree, but again, we're always surprised and pleased by what we can get out of these trees. And just a few more oddball examples. Here we have Machia amurensis, the Amormachia. It's a fabulous common name, isn't it? We'll have to think of a new one. And this has got just some nice, real bright white roots. And then right next door we have paper birch. And these trees have both performed very, very well in gravel beds. And again, just showing the amount of fine roots that you can expect after, just a few weeks or a couple months in gravel. And other species that you might not expect that have done well for us are northern white cedar. They did really good in gravel after one season. Here we are showing it in fall at transplanting. And, that's one of those sensitive species that, planted in the springtime, it might take a hard hit after a dry, hot summer. So fall planting might be a time to try that one out. And other ones like Norway spruce also did pretty well. Not quite the root system that we saw in the northern white cedar, but still another one of those surprises that we said, hey, we haven't tried that one yet, so we'll give it a whirl. So, and again, this shows you the range that we've tried too. Gravel can be used for large trees. It can be used for small trees. A couple before and after shots, just showing you the range in expectations. Freeman maple before and after. Again, just a fabulous root system. And its nice thing is it's a shallow root system. You don't have to dig a deep hole, and that tree is going to really be ready to move right into its new home in the fall. And this has been a really collaborative project, I guess, since we started. I mentioned local tree care companies. We have support from Minnesota DNR, Minnesota Extension, and all of our outstate partners at Morris and U.S. Forest Service, and all throughout the state. And here is our contact information. And we should note here that these are zeros and not O's. They were really clever in assigning us usernames at the ULM here. So make sure that you use zeros for John's 054 at umn.edu or GIBLI 002 at umn.edu. Trees at umn.edu will also get an email into our research team that we can address specific questions that you may have about this presentation or gravel beds in general. And that pretty much wraps it up.
All right. Thank you so much, Chad and Gary. Gary, did you want to come back on, or?
Yeah, I'm going to pass it over to Gary here in just a moment.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks to everybody that joined us, and great questions too. I hope you found this interesting. In our lab, one of our workers, Jacob, is we're just sending it out for review this week. It's a gravel bed primer, kind of breaks it right down to the nuts and bolts of construction, best plants, etc. And we're asking for all comments to be back by the end of April, so we can fix it up, make it look fancy, put it up online, so you can either contact myself or Chad. We'd be more than glad to link you to the electronic copy of it. And it's written for normal people too, so it's not a techie thing.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Gary and Chad. You have me drooling at those root systems. That's just absolutely amazing. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us this afternoon and show us some of the great work that you guys have been doing. Thank you, everybody, for participating. That's it for tonight's presentation. Just a couple of quick reminders here. We would like your feedback, so please, if you can take a moment to go online and fill out the evaluation. We look forward to getting some feedback on the session. And that link should pop up here in the chat box momentarily. And then lastly, just to let you folks know, this next mark your calendar, sorry, trying to multitask here. Mark your calendars for the last webinar in the series. We'll be joined by Mark Whitmore out of Cornell to look at invasive forest pests coming to our area. As many of you know, we just had EAB confirmed in New Hampshire, so obviously another topic that we're very interested in. So mark your calendar. Next webinar is May 15th. Again, same time, same place. And thank you, everybody, again for participating tonight. And happy spring. Thank you, everybody.